Sometime in early 2026, a piece of paper landed at Advanced Micro Devices confirming that the United States government had cleared the company's MI308 accelerator for sale to Chinese customers. The chip had been engineered specifically to thread the needle, designed to fall below the compute thresholds that trigger automatic restriction, built to be licensable. The clearance existed, the market did not. The power to decide what artificial intelligence silicon runs in Chinese data centers did not stay with the agency that issued the export license. It moved to the ministry that issued the procurement directive. That is the chain this script traces. How authority over AI chip access in China migrated, link by confirmed link and then by reported directive, and then by inferred structural shift, out of Washington and into Beijing, and how the mechanism that was supposed to prevent that transfer was the one that completed it. The MI308 license is the object the whole chain pivots on, and it will be sitting right there at the end. Start at the confirmed foundation. Beginning roughly in 2022 and extending through 2023, the United States government built a tiered export control framework targeting advanced artificial intelligence accelerators. The rule was calibrated to compute performance. Chips above defined thresholds required a license to reach Chinese buyers, and for the highest performing configurations, no license would be granted. This is public record. The effect on NVIDIA was immediate and well documented. Its flagship data center processors were cut off from Chinese buyers for most configurations. Advanced Micro Devices faced the same wall on its high-end line. Both companies, operating rationally inside the new constraint, began engineering around it. NVIDIA produced a line of cleared derivatives. Advanced Micro Devices produced the MI308. The logic was straightforward. Design to the threshold, apply for clearance, sell into a market where demand for artificial intelligence compute had not disappeared simply because policy said it should. That is confirmed. The redesign programs were reported across multiple industry outlets. The U.S. export rule tiers are published. The fact of the MI308 receiving clearance in 2026 is the verified anchor this chain is built on. Here is where the chain climbs to its second confirmed link. Advanced Micro Devices filed for and received a United States government export license to sell the MI308 into China. Under U.S. law, the sales channel was open. The license existed. The company had done what the regulatory framework asked, which was to build a chip that does not exceed the threshold and to seek formal permission to sell it. Both boxes were checked. On paper, Advanced Micro Devices had legal market access to a segment where NVIDIA's cleared chips had already demonstrated real demand from Chinese cloud operators. That is the picture at the top of the confirmed portion of the ladder: a valid license, a real chip, an open channel under U.S. law, and then the chain hits link 3, and this is where the reporting takes over from the confirmed record and where the structure begins to turn. Simultaneously with the period in which Advanced Micro Devices was obtaining its clearance, Beijing issued internal directives instructing Chinese artificial intelligence companies to route their procurement toward domestic suppliers. The named targets of the directive were Huawei's Ascend processor line and Cambricon, along with affiliated domestic fabrication. The framing cited national security considerations. ByteDance and Alibaba, two of the largest consumers of data center compute in China, canceled or halted orders for both Advanced Micro Devices and NVIDIA chips. This is reported. The directive framing is reported. The scale of the cancellations and the full procurement data have not been independently verified across multiple sourced audits. That distinction matters, and the chain will return to it. What the reporting describes, if it holds, is a veto applied not at the border, but at the buyer's procurement desk. The U.S. export control framework was designed around the assumption that the decisive choke point was the license itself, that Washington's permission determined what crossed. The MI308 case shows that assumption encountering a second gate it was not designed for. The cancellations reported at ByteDance and Alibaba did not result from U.S. law. They resulted from Chinese procurement policy applied to Chinese buyers. Advanced Micro Devices had a U.S.-issued clearance and a Chinese-issued stop sign, and the stop sign was downstream, closer to the customer, and had no appeals process that an American company could navigate. Think of it this way. A landlord legally owns a building and holds a valid lease with a tenant, but the tenant's employer maintains a standing policy that no employee may occupy a building that is not on the approved list. The lease is real. The employer's list controls the outcome. Advanced Micro Devices is the landlord. The export license is the lease. Beijing's procurement directive is the approved list. The legal instrument and the operative instrument are no longer the same instrument. That is the mechanism the license exposed. This is also where the chain says something that the NVIDIA story alone does not say. NVIDIA's zero-unit outcome is well documented. The company's chips were restricted at the U.S. level for certain configurations, then cleared in a degraded form, then faced their own versions of market friction. That story is covered. The Advanced Micro Devices case is structurally different and less examined, and the difference is precise. Advanced Micro Devices did not fail to obtain a license. It obtained one. That is not a small distinction. It means the gap between paper access and market access has fully opened. Two veto mechanisms now operate in parallel inside the Chinese market. The US mechanism controls what American companies are permitted to offer. The Chinese mechanism controls what Chinese companies are directed to buy. They are separate gates and they do not need to coordinate because each one is sufficient on its own to produce 0 delivered units. That brings the chain to link 4, which is inferred, and the inference should be stated as such. With ByteDance, Alibaba, and likely other large Chinese hyperscalers redirected toward domestic silicon, Huawei, Ascend, and Cambricon absorbed procurement budgets that would otherwise have flowed to Advanced Micro Devices and NVIDIA. Domestic suppliers that were operating below full capacity and were, by most analyst estimates, behind on raw performance began receiving the volume commitments and capital flows that enable industrial scaling. Whether those suppliers are closing the performance gap through volume-driven iteration is analyst estimated, not independently benchmarked at production scale. Public benchmarks of Huawei Ascend at current yields and current volumes are not available. The inference the chain draws is that export control pressure, by redirecting Chinese procurement toward domestic alternatives, functioned as a market creation instrument for the competitors it was meant to disadvantage. That inference is the chain's own construction. A competing explanation that Huawei's development trajectory was already on this path before controls tightened and would have arrived at roughly the same place regardless cannot be ruled out from the public record. The chain flags the gap not to discredit the inference, but because the inference is doing real work here and a reporter's job is to say what the data supports and what it projects. The procurement redirection is reported. The causal claim that the restriction produced the scale-up is inferred. Keep those in separate columns. Link 5 is where the chain arrives at the systemic conclusion, and it sits in a category the outline describes as inferred at the structural level and confirmed at the unit level. The unit level confirmation is clean. Advanced Micro Devices holds a valid US export license and has delivered 0 units in China. NVIDIA holds licenses for certain cleared chips and has also reported 0 or near 0 delivered units for the same reason and in the same period. Those are facts. The systemic conclusion drawn from them is the chain's own analytical construction, not a sourced claim. It is this. The effective embargo on U.S. artificial intelligence silicon in the Chinese market is now enforced by Chinese buyers following Chinese directives, not by U.S. export law. Washington still controls what American companies are allowed to offer. Beijing now controls what Chinese companies are allowed to buy. 2 gates, one open, one closed, and the open one is the one that is not doing any of the work. Here's where the weak parts of the structure need to be said out loud because the chain is thinner in the middle than it is at the ends. The thinnest section runs from the directive reporting through to the domestic acceleration inference. The ByteDance and Alibaba cancellations are reported, and the directive framing is reported, but the full procurement data, the internal directive text, and the scale of the cancellations have not been independently verified across multiple sourced audits. There is a real possibility that the cancellations reflect individual commercial calculations, supply timeline concerns, pricing differences, delivery uncertainties, rather than a coordinated top-down directive. The directive framing is reported, not confirmed. If it dissolves under further reporting into a set of separate commercial decisions, the inversion at link 3 weakens. The outcome does not change. 0 units delivered is 0 units delivered, regardless of whether the mechanism is a directive or a dozen individual procurement decisions that happen to point the same direction. But the structural claim that Beijing now holds the operative veto as a policy matter rather than as an emergent coincidence depends on the directive framing holding. That is the proof gap in the chain. The chain stands on confirmed ground at both ends and on reported and inferred ground in the middle. Anyone fact-checking this should start there. The synthesis is this. Even if the mechanism is murkier than the directive framing suggests, the outcome it produced is clean. Advanced Micro Devices has a license. The market it was designed for is not using it. Whatever produced that outcome is operationally equivalent to a veto, regardless of whether it originated from a single policy document or from 100 individual procurement decisions that pointed the same way. Here's where the chain arrives. Advanced Micro Devices invested engineering resources to design a chip to fit inside the export control threshold. It applied to the United States government for permission to sell that chip into China. It received that permission. The MI308 export license exists, is legally valid, and has produced 0 delivered units. The chain from the first export restriction to that outcome runs through 5 links, 2 of them confirmed, 1 reported, 2 inferred, and the link the entire structure turns on is not the U.S. export decision. It is Beijing's internal directive routing artificial intelligence procurement away from foreign silicon toward domestic alternatives. Remove that directive and the advanced micro devices license functions as intended. Leave it in place and every future U.S. export decision is advisory at best inside the Chinese market. That is the link that determines whether anything upstream or downstream of it matters. The less examined story here is not NVIDIA's zero-share situation, which is covered. It is that advanced micro devices case exposes something structurally new. The US and Chinese veto mechanisms now operate in parallel, and China's has longer reach inside China. A chip can be cleared by one government and blocked by another. Those are not the same event, and conflating them produces a map that no longer matches the territory. The export control regime was calibrated to limit the compute Beijing could access. What the chain also shows is that it calibrated the procurement environment Beijing then used to make US silicon optional by decree. The controls created the conditions that made the directive coherent and the domestic alternatives credible enough to be directed toward. Whether that was anticipated by the architects of the export control framework is not a question this chain can answer from public data. What the chain can say is that the MI 308 license is not a failure of US export policy in the conventional sense. It is the completion of a transfer that US export policy set in motion. The paper that was meant to open a market turned out to be the receipt for closing one. Watch the next procurement cycle from ByteDance and Alibaba. If domestic Ascend orders continue to scale while MI 308 and cleared NVIDIA licenses remain unused, the two-gate structure is stable and self-reinforcing, and the operative veto stays where it has migrated. If Chinese buyers negotiate exceptions to the domestic preference directive under supply crunch pressure because domestic alternatives cannot yet meet performance requirements at scale, the chain bends back. Washington's gate becomes relevant again. That is the variable this story has not yet resolved, and the next reported procurement data will be the first real test of which way it bends. If you track where compute actually flows rather than where policy says it should, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is the only story this channel tells.